We're often critical of media on this podcast, and that's whether it's their coverage of politics, police, Black issues, or the Oscars. They never can really seem to get it right. So this might be because they're so hostile to Black employees that there aren't really many left in their newsrooms, or many to begin with. It could be because they are solely owned by hedge funds and corporations that are also slowly destroying our society and planet, or owned by the government whose existence rests on the continuous colonization of this land. So whatever the reason, we wanted to take this episode to go through some of the recent failures of media in Edmonton, both traditional and independent media, that are kind of in a position where they're supposed to represent the people, keep power in check, and find the truth. All these things, supposedly. So we're going to be talking a bit about their coverage of the School Resource Officer Program, a recent controversy with Edmonton's own Prince of Podcasting, and some problematic efforts by the CBC to cover and represent Black life and culture in Alberta. So we're seeing new research that has been compiled by friend of the show, Bashir Mohammed, and Alex DaCosta on the SRO project in Edmonton. So school resource officers basically were exposed using data that we've never had access to. And that mainly shows that students in Edmonton had 2,068 criminal charges handed down to them by SROs. 679 students were expelled with SRO involvement. 5,228 students were suspended with SRO involvement. And 2,963 students were labeled as offenders. So this is the first time that we've kind of seen any of this information or this data being placed in a centralized way. And it's important also to remind listeners that this is being done by two independent, writers, but really people who are doing this on their spare time. They weren't commissioned to do this by anyone. They weren't given funding to do this. And I think understanding that in the context of, realizing that we do have people who we give funding to, we do have people who we trust to do this kind of work, but it's not necessarily being done by them. Just to jump in here from the editing booth, I wanted to mention that Bashir actually tried to FOIP the Edmonton Police Service in 2019 to access the data that was released for the SRO program, but was actually quoted to pay $64,000 to access that FOIP information. And it's not clear from this data that was released if he actually did pay for this data, like I mentioned, or if there was another means to get access to it. But obviously, $64,000 is a huge deterrent for a civilian, a private person, to do independent research, when again, we mentioned that we've had state-funded media, we have privately owned media funded by advertising that have all been able to essentially investigate these things, but have never done so in all the decades that the SRO program has existed in Edmonton. So if you want to find more information about that project, you can visit their website at www.sroresearchproject.ca. So we actually covered the issue of SROs back in fall of 2020 when we released, I think it was the third episode of our podcast, where we talked to a teacher who was positioned in a school that had a particularly bad SRO. And that's not to say that, there's a distinction between, good or bad. I think ultimately the presence of, officers in this school will continue to incentivize this criminalization, which is ultimately the negative thing. But, we heard stories of sexual assault, of harassment, of, students being targeted, people feeling unsafe. And all of this being done by a teacher anonymously, because there's still a fear of being punished, because there isn't a lot of control of the SRO program by teachers. A lot of it is done in a very top-down way from administration, who are able to weaponize and utilize SROs are, the tools that police have in order to crack down on students in a more punitive way. At that time, too, we also saw media coverage of the program, but, we saw and we noticed that it was particularly soft on the police and on the school board when it was happening. So we saw a suspension of the program in 2020, even though it continued in a more sinister way, arguably, under the Youth Enhanced Deployment Program. That was enough basically to convince the media and allies that the issue was gone. So we didn't necessarily need to see any more coverage or any more analysis of this program. And even on this podcast, I would say that we were, a little bit too quick to interpret the suspension of the program as a win ultimately. I just want to give a few more examples of how the media in Edmonton have been complicit or outright supported the SRO program over the years. To start off, this article from September 23rd, 2014, and the headline reads, Edmonton's School Resource Officers Win Model Agency Award. So essentially, this article was completely written up because the Edmonton Police received an award for their SRO program by, get this, the National Association of School Resource Officers, an association based in the world's hottest destination for policing, United States of America. So this award was given and essentially cited Edmonton School Resource Officers as the Model Agency Award for specialized training they developed, as well as the strong relationship resource officers have with the school communities they have. It's a real puff piece that quotes the police, that quotes the public school superintendents, and that essentially highlights all the amazing things that are being accomplished by the SRO program. The same program that we already know has criminalized thousands of students over the years. The next article that we're going to talk about a little bit is this article by CTV that was published after we saw a broader questioning about the SRO program. And the headline for this one is Police Association Makes Case for SROs to Return to Public Schools. So we're really giving the Police Association and Michael Elliott, who's the president, this outsized platform just to make the case for why their program should return. So I don't know if this kind of treatment is doled out for everyone in public when their services get cut, but police gets a whole article essentially saying that because a grade 10 student was assaulted in November of 2020, essentially that was evidence for school resource officers to be put back into campuses. So there's quotes from the Sergeant Michael Elliott, quote, luckily this case was a Catholic school and there was an SRO present, essentially making the case for, why we need to criminalize students, how these incidences can only be solved by police officers. Continuing with various scare tactics, talking about guns, talking about drug dealers at school, talking about, stolen property, and again, doing all of this through the media. So when we say that the media is complicit, when we say that the media is outwardly supportive of things like the SRO program, doesn't question it, these two articles are, what we're talking about. Speaking about punitive crackdowns based on narratives of fear and inherent criminality of certain groups, I think we're going to talk a little bit more on this episode too about a CBC documentary that touches on these narratives that fit within the criminalization of students with the SRO program, but ultimately that serve to benefit elites in their concentration of power over the rest of our lives. So we're going to talk a bit about that in the rest of the podcast.